It was a gloomy day in the small town of Riverdale when the news of a brutal murder spread like wildfire. The victim was a well-known businessman, John Davis. The news shocked the town and the police had no leads on the killer. The case had gone cold and people were losing hope that the murderer would ever be caught. But one day, a man entered the police station and confessed to the murder. His name was David Matthews and he was a former employee of John Davis. He had been fired from his job a few months ago and he blamed Davis for his financial troubles. He had planned the murder meticulously and executed it with precision. David's confession sent shockwaves through the town. Everyone was eager to know why he did it and how he managed to get away with it for so long. The trial was set, and David was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the judge read out his sentence, David's face remained expressionless. Still, everyone in the courtroom could sense that he was hiding something. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, but David remained tight-lipped about the details of the murder. He had been assigned a public defender and refused to speak to anyone else. However, something changed on the day of his sentencing appeal. The appeal hearing was a formality, and no one expected David to say anything. But as soon as the judge confirmed his life sentence, David stood up and began to speak. His voice was hoarse and his eyes were bloodshot. "I did it," he said, "but there's something you need to know." Everyone in the courtroom held their breath as David spoke. "I didn't act alone," he continued. "There was someone else involved, someone who helped me plan the murder." The courtroom erupted into chaos as people began to speculate about who the mystery accomplice could be. The police launched a new investigation and everyone in the town was on edge. Days turned into weeks, and the police were no closer to identifying the accomplice. But one day, a clue was found that would change everything. A surveillance camera outside John Davis's office had captured footage of two people entering and leaving the building on the night of the murder. The police analyzed the footage and managed to identify one of the individuals. It was a woman named Rachel Adams, who worked with David at the same company. She had disappeared from the town shortly after the murder and had not been heard from since. The police launched a nationwide search for Rachel but could not find her. However, they did manage to track down her sister, Sarah, who lived in a neighboring state. Sarah was shocked to hear about her sister's involvement in the murder and agreed to cooperate with the police. Sarah told the police that Rachel had been in a relationship with John Davis and had been devastated when he broke up with her. She had turned to David for comfort, and he had used her feelings to convince her to help him plan the murder. Rachel had been the one to provide David with the access codes to John Davis's office, and she had also been the one to plant the murder weapon in his car. However, she had never intended for the murder to happen, and when David had told her what he had done, she had fled town in fear. With this new information, the police could charge Rachel with conspiracy to commit murder. She was deported to Riverdale and her trial was set to begin. The trial was a media sensation, and everyone in the town was eager to see justice served. Rachel maintained her innocence throughout the trial, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. David had testified against her, and Sarah had provided the police with a detailed account of Rachel's involvement in the murder plot. As the trial progressed, tensions in the courtroom grew higher and higher. Rachel's defense attorney argued that David had coerced her and that she had not intended for the murder to happen. But the prosecution had a strong case against her, and it seemed like she would be found guilty. Rachel's defense attorney made a shocking revelation on the last day of the trial. He presented evidence that showed that David had been lying all along. He had changed his story multiple times and there were inconsistencies in his testimony. The defense attorney argued that David had acted alone and that he had made up the story about Rachel to reduce his sentence. He also presented evidence that showed that David had a history of violence and had been in trouble with the law before. The prosecution was caught off guard by this new evidence, and they requested a recess to review the defense's claims. The judge granted the request, and the courtroom was silent as everyone awaited the decision. After a few minutes, the judge returned and announced that he was dismissing the charges against Rachel due to a lack of evidence. The courtroom erupted into chaos as people cheered and hugged Rachel, who was visibly relieved. But the celebrations were short-lived. As Rachel was leaving the courthouse, she was attacked by an unknown assailant. The attacker wore a mask and no one could see his face. He hit Rachel over the head with a blunt object and then fled the scene. Rachel was rushed to the hospital and treated for her injuries. She was in a coma for several days and no one knew if she would survive. The police launched a chase for the attacker, but they could not find any leads. As Rachel lay in a hospital, a shadowy figure watched her from outside of her window. He was the real killer and had been watching the trial from the beginning. He had planned the murder carefully and had used David as a pawn in his game. The killer had been watching Rachel too, and he knew that she was the weak link in the murder plot. He had been planning to kill her all along, and he had waited until the trial was over to make his move. The killer had been careful not to leave any evidence behind and knew he was in the clear, but he had not counted on Rachel surviving the attack. He had thought that he had finished the job, but now he knew that he had to eliminate her once and for all. The killer waited until the hospital was quiet before sneaking into Rachel's room. He was wearing gloves and a mask and carrying a syringe filled with deadly poison. He injected Rachel with the poison, then, undetected, slipped out of the room. Rachel's condition deteriorated rapidly and was pronounced dead a few hours later. The police were baffled by her death and could not understand how the killer had managed to get into the hospital undetected. The killer was still out there and he was watching the police as they investigated Rachel's death. He knew that they would never catch him and he felt invincible. He had pulled off the perfect crime and knew he would never be caught. But he was wrong. The police had a new lead and they were closing in on him. They traced the killer's movements through CCTV footage and knew where he had been hiding. They were preparing to make an arrest and the killer had no idea that his time was up. On the night of his arrest, the killer was sleeping soundly in his hideout when the police stormed in. He was caught off guard and he had no chance of escaping. He was arrested and taken into custody. During the interrogation, the killer initially denied any involvement in the murder of Rachel, but as the evidence against him piled up, he eventually broke down and confessed. He revealed that he had been obsessed with Rachel for years and that he had planned the murder meticulously. He had manipulated David into carrying out the killing, knowing that he would take the fall and that Rachel would be blamed. The killer had been watching the trial closely, knowing he had to eliminate Rachel to cover his tracks. He had waited until the trial was over and then made his move, but he had not counted on her surviving the attack. In the end, the killer was found guilty of Rachel's murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The courtroom was packed as the sentence was read out, and there was a sense of closure as the killer was led away in handcuffs. The verdict brought some measure of peace to Rachel's family and friends. They had been through a traumatic ordeal, but justice had been served. They could finally begin to move on from the tragedy and remember Rachel for the kind, loving person she had been. As for David, he was released from prison and went into hiding. He knew that the killer was still out there and that he might be in danger. But he also knew that he had played a part in Rachel's death and would have to live with that guilt for the rest of his life. The story of Rachel's murder became national news, shocking the country. It served as a reminder that there are people capable of unspeakable acts of violence and that we must always be vigilant. But it also showed the resilience and strength of the human spirit. Despite the tragedy, Rachel's loved ones banded together and supported each other. They never lost hope that justice would be served. In the end, Rachel's memory lived on, not as a victim, but as a symbol of hope and perseverance. Her legacy would inspire others to stand up against injustice and fight for what is right, and her family and friends would continue to honor her memory, cherishing the time they had spent with her and her impact on their lives. Thus, the story of Rachel's murder has ended, but its impact on those involved will last a lifetime. Stay tuned for more compelling tales of suspense and intrigue as we continue to delve into the shadows of the human psyche and uncover the truth within. There's always something to discover, learn, and fear. So keep your eyes and ears open and ready for what happens next. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for even more interesting content. Stay tuned for our next video and thanks for watching. Check it out.